Hi everyone, and welcome to what will be our final installment of the Festivals and Fireworks Sew-Along, hosted by Pat Sloan at her website, ilovetomakequilts.com. This week we need to make 4 blocks, and as Pat would have already mentioned in her video for today, we will be doing this over the next 2 weeks instead of the one. So I've already made all 4 of mine, and as you can see behind me here, I actually have my quilt top completely assembled. I will be adding another border to it, but I haven't decided how big I want to make that yet. So the 4 blocks that we're making over the next 2 weeks are the ones in the top corners here. So the red one, the pink one, and down the bottom we've got green, and behind me is a yellow one. So grab your fabric, grab your favorite beverage, come with me, and I'll show you how I do it. As with every other week of this sew-along, you'll find in the description box below a link to the cutting directions as I'm showing you now for you to download. The thing to remember for this week is with your print fabrics, we need to cut enough to make 4 separate blocks. So that would be 4 of the D squares and 2 of the E squares in each of those colors. If you're using all of the one color, then you would just do the total. This week's block will be made up by doing a diamond in a square for the center and some flying geese for around the outside. Now we need 4 flying geese, so guess what that means? We're going to use the 4 at a time flying geese method, and for that we'll grab our fabrics B and D. You'll have 1 large square of B per block and 4 smaller squares being the D squares per block also. We'll start by drawing a diagonal line from corner to corner on the back of our D squares before lining those up diagonally across the large B square, forming a straight line through the middle of the large square and taking it to the machine and stitching 1/4 of an inch on each side of the drawn line. Now that we've done our stitching on each side of our drawn line, I just like to give this a press first to set those seams. I'll then cut it in half along that drawn line before pressing each of the smaller peaks up away from the large white triangle in my instance. We'll then take the remaining 2 smaller D squares and place them once again from the side with the peaks down to the corner and take that to the machine and stitch 1/4 of an inch on each side of that drawn line. With that now done, I'll once again give this a quick press to set those seams before cutting it along the drawn line to give us our 4 flying geese units. These units will then need to have their little peaks pressed up away from the center before we get to trimming them down. As you may or may not be aware, depending on if you're new here or an old hat, I prefer to trim these down using the Creative Grids Ultimate Flying Geese tool. You look to the chart on the top left hand corner of the tool to get the reference line for trimming down, and in this instance we are making a finished measurement of 4x8, which is the maximum that this tool will do. We place those the markings for the peak of the flying geese inside the peak of our unit, and we trim the first 2 sides. We then rotate both the block and the tool. We line up those reference lines once again and trim the final 2 sides, and you will have perfect flying geese every single time. As I've said in the previous weeks, you can do this with a standard quilting ruler, and once again I'll pop a link in the top right of your screen now to my tutorial for making flying geese 4 at a time, where I go through this in depth and in detail. It's now time to make our diamond in a square, or square in a square, or square on point block, depending on what you want to call it. And for this we need our fabrics C and E. Now you will have 2 E squares here, and we first of all need to cut those just once on the diagonal to give us 4 half square triangles. We'll take 2 of those half square triangles and find the center of the longest side as well as the center of our middle C square. We'll then line those up, putting the half square triangle on the bottom, and pin that in place and take it to our machine and stitch on the 2 opposing sides with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The reason we put the bias piece on the bottom is so that the feed dogs will take up any extra stretch that may occur during the sewing, and you'll have a perfectly flat piece. We refer to this as bob, or bias on bottom. I have talked about this in the previous weeks, where we've made the same diamond in a square for the center of our blocks. Once we've got the first 2 sides on, you'll see me trim away the little dog ears that are on the outside before repeating this process to put the final 2 pieces on. With these pieces we will press towards the center of the block, and I'll stop again at that point in the video and talk about why. With the first 2 sides sewn, as I said, we'll just give this a press to set those seams first. Then I'm going to trim those little dog ears off so that they're out of the way for when we go to sew our next pieces on. And we are going to press these towards the middle. The reason we're going to press them towards the middle of the block is so that it nests nicely with our flying geese when we're creating our rows, and then ultimately creating our block, and I'll get to that when we hit that part of the video. So once again, just going to find the center of our white square and our half square triangle units, put the bias on the bottom, and sew these final 2 sides, making sure that we press towards the middle. We now need to trim this center block down, and I like to use my rotating mat for this, and I also have an 8.5 by 12.5 Creative Grids ruler that is the perfect tool for trimming this down. But don't worry, if you don't have this and you just have the standard 6.5, you can still use that. All you need to do is line your 4.25 inch mark up from peak to peak, as you can see me doing there. And in my instance, I can trim both sides because I have the 8.5 inch ruler. But if you only had a 6.5 inch ruler, you would trim one side and then spin that around, line that 4.25 up again along your center and trim the other side. Then we just need to rotate the block and repeat this to get our 8.5 inch trim down. So once again, I'm lucky and I have the 8.5 by 12.5 inch ruler, so I can do both sides at once. But if you have the standard or more common 6.5 by 12.5, you can do the same thing. You just need to trim each side separately as you go around the block, maintaining your squareness. Once we've got this trimmed down, we'll be ready for final block construction. Now that we have all of the components required to make our block made and trimmed to perfection, it's time to lay it out as per the pattern. I've also put the inset there in the top left hand corner for you to reference. We'll then need to construct this using classic 9-patch construction rules, which means we'll start by sewing all of our vertical seams and then our final 2 horizontal seams. We'll press these in much similar fashion to the previous weeks, where we'll press out towards the corners on the top and the bottom row, and we will open up the seam in the middle to reduce that bulk where our points meet. You'll notice here as I go to join the second row that because we pressed the square in a square in towards the center and the flying geese unit out and away, we will actually be able to nest this seam nicely. And once we get our seams all lined up and nested, we'll pop a pin in there to hold that. Then when we're stitching it, we'll just watch where our needle goes to make sure that we're just to the right hand side of our stitching that is crossed over, and you won't lose that point. First of our vertical seams now done, we'll just give this a quick finger press to hold it while we put the final vertical row on. And as I said, we'll press out towards the solid square on the corner, and we will open up the seam in the middle block. And when we come to join the top and the bottom row, we will snip our seam so that we can nest it. And then once again on the bottom row, we'll press out towards the solid square. We'll then do those final vertical seams, and we'll give this a all over press before doing our horizontal seams. You'll see here how I've snipped on either side of our peak, so only the central portion of the seam is pressed open, and outside of that we're pressing in towards the middle. This is so that we can nest our seams when we come to attach our horizontal rows. So we'll pin the first one in place and stitch that, making sure that we match up our peaks again on our flying geese and the diamond in a square. And we'll sew our 2 horizontal seams, and this week's block and all of the blocks required for festivals and fireworks, once you make the other 3 of these, will be done. You will notice here that I treat these the same as I did those other 2 side seams, where I'm clipping on just one piece of the fabric either side of that peak so that we can open up the center, and then on either side of that we're pressing towards the solid square on the top and the bottom row. This is the path of the least resistance for everything, and this will give you the flattest block possible. Now that we have all of that stitched and pressed to perfection, I'm just showing you here where we've just got the center of those seams opened and everything else is pressed towards the corners, and this gives us a beautifully flat block. So that's it, folks, the final week of our festivals and fireworks sew along. As I said at the beginning, you do have 2 weeks to make all 4 of the necessary blocks. There will be a short break in between this and the next Block Wednesday, and during that time I am going to show you a pattern that I've Frankensteined from 2 free patterns that I found called Bunnies and Blooms, and I've put that on the screen for you to see now. Hopefully you'll join me for this sew along in the interim, and I'm sure that Pat will also have something fun for you to do during this little break. As always, thanks so much for joining me this week, folks, and if you've liked what you've seen today, like the video, share it with a friend, consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. Most importantly, tickle that little bell to be notified of all my future updates so you won't miss a thing. I'll see you all again next week, and bye for now.